Picture this. You wake one morning in July, and there's frost on the windowsill. The sky hangs heavy and gray, as if winter has forgotten to leave. The air tastes of ash and carries an otherworldly chill that seeps through your bones, even in the height of what should be summer. Throughout human history, we've lived at the mercy of forces far beyond our control. The slow shift of ice sheets, the rumble of distant mountains, the invisible dance of atmospheric currents that can turn abundance into famine with a single breath. Tonight, we're going to explore those moments when nature reminded humanity just how small we really are. Before we settle in together for this journey through time, if you enjoy what we do here, these quiet explorations of the past, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe to join our community of fellow night owls and history lovers. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, there's something wonderfully connecting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, sharing these stories in the darkness. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's drift back to a time when the sun forgot how to shine. We'll begin our exploration in the year 1816, when summer never came, and the world held its breath in an endless, hungry twilight. Verse 1. The year without a summer. Daily life in 1816. The morning of June 6, 1816, dawned cold and strange across New England. In Williamstown, Massachusetts, a man named Chauncey Jerome stepped outside his workshop and found snow dusting the wooden shingles of his roof. Snow. In June. He stood there for a long moment, his breath visible in the air, watching the white flakes settle on the green leaves of his apple trees like some peculiar blessing from a confused season. Jerome was a clockmaker, a man who understood the precise movements of time, the reliable tick and tock of mechanical certainty. But that morning, time itself seemed broken. The natural clock of the seasons had stuttered to a halt, leaving the world suspended in an endless gray winter that stretched on and on. What Jerome didn't know, what no one in his small Massachusetts town could know, was that 13 months earlier, on the other side of the world, a mountain had torn itself apart. Mount Tambora, on the island of Samoa in what is now Indonesia, had erupted with a violence that defied comprehension. The explosion was heard 1,200 miles away. Entire villages vanished in an instant, swallowed by pyroclastic flows that moved faster than horses could run. The mountain itself lost 4,000 feet of height, collapsing inward like a broken crown. But it wasn't the immediate destruction that would reshape the world. It was what came after, the 38 cubic miles of rock, ash, and sulfur dioxide that rose into the stratosphere like a vast, choking breath. This debris formed a veil around the Earth, a curtain that dimmed the sun and scattered its warmth back into space. By the spring of 1816, this invisible shroud had circled the globe, and the world began to shiver. In Vermont, farmers woke to find their sheep huddled together in the corners of their fields, their wool stiff with ice. The growing season, which should have begun in earnest by May, never truly started. Seeds rotted in the cold, wet soil. Those that did sprout withered under frosts that came night after night, relentless and unseasonable. Sarah Goodhue, a farmer's wife in Putney, Vermont, kept a diary that year. Her entries from June read like dispatches from an alien world. Very cold, ice thick as window glass. Corn frozen, vegetation backward. Her words are spare, practical, but beneath them runs a current of growing unease. This wasn't just bad weather. This was something beyond their experience, beyond their ability to plan or prepare. The cold wasn't confined to New England. Across the Atlantic, in the green fields of Ireland, potato crops blackened and died. In France, the vineyards that had produced wine for centuries struggled to ripen their grapes. The harvest, when it came, was meager and sour. In Germany, the Rhine River Valley, normally lush and productive, yielded crops so poor that by winter, people were grinding bark and sawdust into their bread. But perhaps nowhere was the strangeness more palpable than in the daily rhythms of ordinary life. In London, the summer of 1816 was marked by what one contemporary called a dry fog, a persistent haze that made the sun appear as a pale, reddish disk like a dying ember in the sky. The light was wrong, people said. It felt thin, weak, as if it had traveled too far to reach them. Mary Godwin, who would later become Mary Shelley, spent that eerie summer in a villa beside Lake Geneva with her lover Percy Shelley and their friend Lord Byron. The weather kept them indoors day after day, the lake shrouded in mist, the mountains lost in gray clouds that never seemed to lift. It was during those long, gloomy hours that Byron challenged his companions to write ghost stories to pass the time. Mary began to write about a young scientist who discovered the secret of creating life, only to be horrified by his creation. The monster in her story was born from that summer without sun, from the unnatural gloom that had settled over the world like a curse. Frankenstein, she would later say, came to her in the strange twilight of 1816, when it felt as though nature itself had turned against humanity. The economic consequences of the failed harvests began to ripple outward as autumn approached. In New England, the price of oats essential food for both humans and livestock rose from 50 cents a bushel to over $1. Families who had lived comfortably on their farms for generations found themselves facing choices they had never imagined: sell the land or watch their children go hungry. Many chose to leave. The westward migration that would later be called the year without a summer migration began as a trickle and became a flood. Entire families loaded their possessions into wagons and headed west toward Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, anywhere the soil might be more forgiving than the frost-blasted fields they left behind. The Whitman family of Massachusetts loaded their few remaining possessions into a covered wagon in October of 1816. Eliza Whitman, pregnant with her third child, sat beside her husband Jonas as their ox team slowly pulled away from the only home she had ever known. Her diary records the moment with heartbreaking simplicity. Left mother's house at 10 o'clock. Did not look back. They were part of a procession of the dispossessed. Families streaming west on roads turned to mud by the constant, cold rain. The inns along the way were overwhelmed. Travelers slept in barns, in their wagons, anywhere they could find shelter. Many never reached their destinations. Disease followed in the wake of the migration: typhus, cholera, dysentery spread by crowded conditions and contaminated water. In Ohio, the arriving migrants were not always welcome. Local newspapers warned of the plague of Yankees descending on their communities, bringing with them stories of failed crops and bitter winters. But the migrants kept coming, driven by a desperation that overcame both pride and fear. The animals suffered alongside the humans. In Vermont, sheep froze to death in the fields. Horses, weakened by poor feed, collapsed while plowing the hard, unyielding soil. Birds migrated late or not at all, confused by the unseasonable cold. The natural world seemed as bewildered as the human one. In New Hampshire, a farmer named William Bixby wrote to his brother, "The crows are so tame you can almost catch them with your hands. They sit on the fence posts like they're waiting for something, but I don't think they know what." The psychological toll was perhaps hardest to measure, but impossible to ignore. Children who should have spent the summer barefoot in green meadows instead huddled by fires in June. Mothers scanned empty skies for signs of clearing weather that never came. Men stood in their barren fields, hands on their hips, staring at crops that would never grow. There was a quality of waiting that summer, a sense that the world was holding its breath. Church attendance swelled as people sought answers in scripture and prayer. Some preachers declared the cold summer a sign of God's displeasure, a warning to repent. Others preached of patience, of faith in the natural order that would surely return. But for many, faith was harder to sustain as the weeks passed and the warmth never came. Suicides increased that year, recorded in the sparse language of coroners' reports. Death by his own hand, found in the barn, suspended by a rope. The darkness seemed to seep not just into the sky, but into the human heart. By August, when the frost should have been months away, ice formed on ponds across New England. Children who had never seen ice in summer broke it with sticks and stones, marveling at this strange reversal of the natural world. But for their parents, each frozen morning was another day of failed hope, another step toward winter and famine. The stories from that summer have a dreamlike quality, as if the world had slipped sideways into some alternate reality. In Connecticut, a wedding was held in the bride's family parlor because it was too cold to hold the ceremony outdoors. The guests kept their coats on throughout the service. In Maine, a sea captain reported icebergs in July, drifting south from Greenland like messengers from a world permanently frozen. As September arrived, still cold, still gray, many families began to understand that this was not simply a bad season, but something unprecedented in their experience. The old certainties, the reliable rhythms of planting and harvest, of summer warmth and winter cold, had been disrupted by forces they could neither see nor understand. The harvest, when it finally came, was a bitter joke. Corn ears were the size of a man's thumb. Potatoes, where they grew at all, were small and watery. Families who had planned to fill their root cellars with enough food to last the winter, instead stared at meager piles that might last until Christmas if they were careful. And yet, in the midst of all this hardship, there were moments of strange beauty. The sunsets that summer were spectacular, painted in deep reds and oranges by the volcanic dust in the atmosphere. The same particles that blocked the warming sun also created skies of unusual brilliance, as if the world were lit from within by some cold fire. Artists across Europe painted those extraordinary sunsets, not knowing they were documenting the visible trace of a mountain that had died on the other side of the world. The ash of Tambora hung in the air like powdered time, each sunset a reminder of the vast, invisible connections that bind our world together. As the year wound toward its close, survivors of the summer that never was began to make sense of what they had endured. Some saw in it a lesson about human resilience, about the ability to adapt and endure. Others saw a warning about the fragility of the systems that sustained their lives. But perhaps the most profound legacy of 1816 was the way it changed how people thought about their place in the world. The generation that lived through the year without a summer understood, in a way their grandparents never had, that they were not masters of their environment, but passengers on a planet, subject to forces beyond their control or comprehension. In the cold light of that endless winter, humanity had glimpsed its own vulnerability, and the world would never look quite the same again. Verse 2. The end of the Greenland Vikings, a slow fade into winter. The transition from one kind of climate catastrophe to another is like watching shadows lengthen across centuries. Where the year without a summer struck the world like a sudden blow, the story we turn to now unfolded over generations, a slow, creeping cold that gradually squeezed the life from one of history's most remarkable experiments in human adaptation. In the summer of 1408, somewhere along the western coast of Greenland, a young Norse woman named Sigrid stood at the edge of her family's homestead, watching the ice floes drift past in the gray waters of the fjord. The ice was thicker that year than her grandmother remembered, and it stayed longer, sometimes blocking the harbor well into July. Sigrid was among the last generation of Vikings to call Greenland home, though she couldn't have known it at the time. The Norse had come to Greenland over 4 centuries earlier, following Eric the Red's bold claim that this ice-locked land was actually green and fertile. It was a masterful piece of medieval marketing, designed to lure settlers to what seemed like the edge of the world. But here's the remarkable thing. For a time, Eric's promise wasn't entirely false. When the first Norse ships arrived in 986 AD, they found a land that, while challenging, was surprisingly livable. The climate was in the midst of what we now call the medieval warm period. Summers were long enough to grow barley and hay. The fjords teemed with seals. The pastures, though small, supported cattle and sheep. It was marginal, yes, but it was home. Stjordhild, Eric the Red's wife, established the first church in Greenland, a tiny stone structure that archaeologists would later call the Church of Stjordhild. From her doorway, she could see green meadows stretching down to the water's edge, where her husband's cattle grazed in the long Arctic summer. The Norse called their settlements the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, and at their peak, they supported perhaps 5,000 people across 280 farms. These weren't temporary outposts or trading stations. These were communities built to last, with stone churches, elaborate burial grounds, and farmsteads that grew more sophisticated with each generation. The Norse in Greenland developed their own culture, distinct from their relatives in Iceland and Norway. They learned to hunt seals through breathing holes in the ice, to navigate by the stars during the long Arctic night, to survive in conditions that would have defeated most medieval Europeans. Magnus Eriksson lived in the Eastern Settlement in the early 1200s, during what may have been the height of Norse Greenland's prosperity. His farmstead sat in a protected valley where the summer sun lingered long into the evening. He kept 40 head of cattle, an impressive herd by Greenland standards, and his family lived in a stone house with thick walls and small windows designed to hold the heat. In Magnus's time, ships arrived regularly from Iceland and Norway, bringing iron tools, grain, and news from the outside world. The Norse traded walrus ivory, sealskins, and polar bear pelts luxury goods that commanded high prices in European markets. They were part of a network that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. But even in Magnus's day, there were signs that the world was changing. The old-timers spoke of summers that had been longer, of ice that had been thinner. The growing season was becoming shorter, more unpredictable. Some years, the hay harvest failed entirely, and families watched their cattle starve through the long winter. The climate was shifting, though so gradually that each generation adapted to conditions slightly worse than their parents had known. What we now call the Little Ice Age was beginning, and Greenland, perched on the edge of the habitable world, would be among the first places to feel its grip. By 1300, the Western Settlement, the more northerly of the two Norse communities, was struggling. The farms there had always been marginal, dependent on the brief Arctic summer to grow enough hay to feed the livestock through winter. As the summers grew shorter and colder, the arithmetic of survival became increasingly difficult. Bjorn Thorson was one of the last farmers in the Western Settlement. His family had worked the same land for 6 generations, but by 1340, he was facing a choice that would have been unthinkable to his ancestors. The summer that year had been so cold that the hay never properly cured. Most of it rotted in the fields, black and useless. His cattle were already thin, and winter was still months away. The decision to abandon a farmstead that had been in his family for 2 centuries must have been agonizing. But Bjorn packed what he could carry and led his surviving animals south toward the Eastern Settlement, leaving behind the stone house his great-grandfather had built, the burial ground where his ancestors rested, the small church where he had been baptized. He was not alone. By 1350, the Western Settlement was empty, its farms abandoned, its churches silent. The Norse who remained in Greenland had consolidated into the Eastern Settlement, but even there, the margins were growing thinner with each passing year. The archaeological record of this period tells a story of gradual adaptation and increasing desperation. The Norse began to supplement their traditional diet with more seal meat, less beef. They modified their houses, building them smaller and lower to conserve heat. They started using driftwood for fuel more frequently, as the dwarf birch that had once grown in the valleys became scarce. But perhaps most tellingly, they began to eat their dogs. This was a significant cultural shift for a people who had always maintained the medieval European distinction between animals kept for companionship and those raised for food. The decision to slaughter their dogs for meat was a measure of how desperate the situation had become. Ingrid Olafsdor was born around 1380 into a world that was already much colder than the one her ancestors had known. Her family's farm, once prosperous, now struggled to support even a few cattle. The barley that had once grown in their fields was now impossible to cultivate. The growing season had shortened to perhaps 3 months, barely enough to cure hay for winter feed. Ingrid's world was one of constant calculation. How much food to set aside for the winter? How many animals to slaughter in the fall? How much driftwood to collect for fuel? Every decision was a gamble against the weather, against the ice, against the inexorable advance of winter. But life continued, even in these diminished circumstances. Children were born, couples married, the rituals of community life persisted. The Norse in Greenland developed a kind of stoic pragmatism, an acceptance of hardship that allowed them to find meaning and even moments of joy in increasingly difficult circumstances. The church remained central to community life, perhaps more so as the physical world became harsher. The stone churches built by earlier generations were carefully maintained, their small windows filled with precious glass brought from Europe. On Sundays, families would gather to hear Mass, to share news, to maintain the social bonds that were essential for survival in such an isolated place. Trade with the outside world became increasingly sporadic. Ships that once arrived annually now came only every few years, and sometimes not at all. The Norse had to become more self-sufficient, but this was increasingly difficult as the climate continued to deteriorate. The 1400s brought new challenges. The ice pack expanded, making navigation more dangerous and unpredictable. Storms became more frequent and severe. The permafrost crept higher into the valleys, making farming even more difficult. What had once been marginal land became impossible to cultivate. By 1450, the population of the eastern settlement had dwindled to perhaps a few hundred people scattered across a handful of farms. These were the descendants of Vikings, but they lived lives that would have been barely recognizable to their ancestors. They had become Arctic hunter-gatherers, more dependent on seals and fish than on the cattle and sheep that had once been the foundation of their economy. The last written record from Norse Greenland dates to 1408, a marriage certificate from Halsey Church, recording the wedding of Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir. After that, the documentary record goes silent. The Norse in Greenland fade from history, leaving behind only the stone ruins of their churches and farms and the questions of what happened to them. Some may have died of starvation or disease. Others may have been absorbed into the Inuit population, which was expanding southward as the climate changed. A few may have managed to book passage on the last ships to reach Greenland, returning to Iceland or Norway as refugees from a land that had become uninhabitable. But for most, the end probably came not with drama, but with a quiet exhaustion, a gradual recognition that the land could no longer support them. Imagine the last Norse farmer in Greenland, standing in the doorway of his stone house, looking out at fields that would never again yield a harvest, at a fjord locked in ice that would never melt. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind, the cry of seabirds, and the distant sound of ice grinding against the shore. The great Norse experiment in Arctic colonization had ended not with conquest or catastrophe, but with a slow fade into winter, a retreat before the advance of ice and cold that would not be reversed for centuries. When European explorers returned to Greenland in the 1500s, they found the Norse settlements empty and overgrown. The stone churches stood roofless, their walls slowly crumbling. The farms had been reclaimed by Arctic vegetation. It was as if an entire civilization had simply vanished, leaving only traces in stone and bone to mark their passage. The end of Norse Greenland stands as one of history's most poignant examples of human vulnerability to climate change. These were not primitive people unprepared for harsh conditions. They were skilled farmers and hunters, adaptable and resilient, who had survived in one of the world's most challenging environments for over 4 centuries. Yet when the climate shifted beyond their ability to adapt, they had no choice but to retreat, to abandon the land their ancestors had claimed and cultivated for so many generations. In the ruins of their settlements, archaeologists have found evidence of their final years. Smaller houses, simpler tools, signs of a people making do with less and less. But they have also found evidence of persistence, of communities that continued to baptize their children, to marry their young people, to maintain their cultural traditions, even as their world grew colder and harder. The last Norse Greenlanders were not defeated by a single catastrophe, but worn down by the slow accumulation of difficult years, by the gradual recognition that the land they loved could no longer sustain them. Their story is one of quiet heroism, of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with dignity and grace, even as their world slowly turned to ice around them. Verse 3. The Great Stink of London, 1858. When the city held its breath, from the slow fade of civilizations in the Arctic, we shift now to the summer when London, the beating heart of the world's greatest empire, was brought to its knees not by war or plague, but by the smell of its own existence. The morning of June 15th, 1858, dawned hot and still over the Thames. By midday, the temperature had climbed to nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit, extraordinary heat for London, where summer days more often resembled a gentle warming than a furnace. But it wasn't the heat alone that made this day memorable. It was what the heat revealed, what it cooked and concentrated and lifted into the air like some vast, invisible plague. The Thames, that great ribbon of water that had carried Roman galleys and Tudor barges, that had witnessed the rise of an empire, had become London's open sewer. And on this particular day, in this particular heat, the river began to exhale 4 centuries of human waste in a concentrated perfume that would bring the greatest city in the world to a standstill. Charles Dickens, walking along the Thames embankment that morning, pressed his handkerchief to his nose and mouth. Even he, who had made his reputation describing the squalor of London's poor, was unprepared for the assault on his senses. The smell, he would later write, was most head and stomach distressing. It rose from the water like a living thing, a presence so overwhelming that it seemed to have weight and substance. The Thames in 1858 was not really a river anymore. It was a slow-moving cesspool, the final destination for everything London wanted to forget. The city's 200,000 cesspits had been connected to the storm drains in the 1840s, a measure intended to reduce cholera by washing waste away from homes. But away simply meant into the Thames, and the Thames, tidal and sluggish, had nowhere to send it. On that sweltering June morning, the low tide exposed vast mudflats along the riverbank, black and glistening with a mixture of sewage, industrial waste, and the decomposing bodies of dead animals. The sun beat down on this exposed misery, cooking it, concentrating it, sending waves of putrid air rolling across the city like a toxic fog. At the Houses of Parliament, which sat directly on the river, the smell was so overpowering that MPs soaked the curtains in chloride of lime, a primitive disinfectant that burned the eyes and throat. But even this desperate measure provided little relief. Many members simply fled the chamber, unable to conduct business in such conditions. Benjamin Disraeli, the future Prime Minister, rose to address the House with a handkerchief pressed to his nose. His words, muffled by the cloth, were barely audible. The state of the Thames is a most serious matter, and I have to apologize to the House for referring to it. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The politicians, who governed an empire that spanned the globe, could not govern their own noses. But the Great Stink, as it came to be known, was not merely a matter of unpleasant odors. It was a crisis that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between medieval city planning and modern urban population. London in 1858 was home to nearly 3 million people, all of them producing waste, all of them needing water, all of them living in a city whose infrastructure had been designed for a much smaller population. The morning routine of Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, a middle-class widow living in Belgravia, illustrates how the smell infiltrated every aspect of daily life. She woke, as she always did, at 7 o'clock, but instead of opening her windows to let in the morning air, she kept them firmly shut. Even so, the smell seeped through the cracks, a persistent presence that made her morning tea taste of decay. Her maid, Sarah, had to be sent to the market early, before the heat of the day made the smell unbearable. But even at dawn, the odor hung over the city like a pall, making the simple act of buying bread an exercise in endurance. Sarah would later remember that summer as the time when the very air seemed poisoned. The Thames had been London's lifeline for centuries, but by 1858, it had become its curse. The river that had brought prosperity and trade to the city now carried death and disease. Cholera outbreaks, though less frequent than in earlier decades, still struck with terrifying randomness. The connection between contaminated water and disease was beginning to be understood, but the infrastructure to address the problem barely existed. Dr. John Snow, the pioneering epidemiologist who had linked cholera to contaminated water supplies, walked the streets of London that summer with a kind of grim satisfaction. He had been warning about the dangers of sewage contamination for years, but his warnings had largely fallen on deaf ears. Now, with the smell of the Thames making his point more eloquently than any scientific paper, perhaps people would finally listen. The heat wave continued day after day, with temperatures reaching levels that would have been remarkable in any year. But 1858 was particularly brutal, with week after week of blazing sun and still air. The Thames, normally cooled by tides and breezes, became a stagnant soup. Dead fish floated on the surface, their silver bellies catching the light like coins scattered on dark water. The omnibus drivers, whose routes crossed the river, began to demand hazard pay. Passengers would board at one side of the bridge with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, only to disembark at the other side, gasping and retching. Some simply refused to cross the river at all, preferring to walk miles out of their way rather than endure the assault on their senses. But it wasn't just the wealthy who suffered. In the slums of the East End, where open sewers ran alongside the streets and cesspits overflowed into basements, the smell was even worse. Children played in alleys where the very air seemed thick with decay. Women hung laundry that would absorb the odor before it could dry, making the choice between dirty clothes and clothes that reeked of sewage. The city's hospitals reported a surge in cases of what they called miasmatic fever, illness caused, they believed, by bad air. Doctors prescribed smelling salts and recommended that patients breathe through wet cloths soaked in vinegar. The wealthy fled to the countryside if they could, leaving London to the poor and the desperate. The crisis reached its peak in July, when the temperature soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Thames, exposed by an unusually low tide, revealed its secrets in horrifying detail. Centuries of waste lay baking in the sun, creating a smell so powerful that it could be detected miles from the river. The city's entire economy began to slow as people simply could not function in such conditions. The House of Commons, in desperation, approved emergency funding for what would become the greatest engineering project of the Victorian age, the construction of a comprehensive sewer system for London. Joseph Bazalgette, the chief engineer, had been advocating for such a system for years, but his plans had been rejected as too expensive, too ambitious, too disruptive to daily life. Now, with MPs gagging on the smell of their own waste, Bazalgette's plans suddenly seemed not just reasonable, but urgent. The project would take 7 years to complete and would require the excavation of millions of tons of earth, the laying of hundreds of miles of pipe, and the construction of massive pumping stations. But in the heat of that terrible summer, with the Thames exhaling its poison into the air. No price seemed too high to pay. The immediate solutions were desperate and largely ineffective. Boats were sent out to pour chloride of lime into the river, turning the water a sickly green, but doing little to address the underlying problem. The smell, if anything, became worse, as the chemical reaction between the lime and the waste created new and even more unpleasant odors. Street vendors began selling smelling bottles, small vials of lavender, oil, or other fragrant substances that people could hold under their noses while walking. These became so popular that they were often sold out by midday. The sight of well-dressed Londoners walking through the streets with bottles pressed to their noses became one of the defining images of that summer. The heat wave finally broke in August, but by then the damage was done. The Great Stink had exposed the fundamental unsustainability of London's growth. The city had become too large, too crowded, too complex for its medieval infrastructure. The smell had been a symptom, but the disease was deeper. A failure to adapt urban planning to urban reality. The psychological impact of the Great Stink was perhaps as significant as its physical effects. Londoners had prided themselves on living in the center of the civilized world, the capital of an empire that spanned the globe. Yet that summer, their city had been reduced to a place where the simple act of breathing was an ordeal. The smell had been a great equalizer, affecting rich and poor alike, reminding everyone that beneath the veneer of Victorian prosperity lay a city still, struggling with the basic challenges of human waste and water. The Thames, that great highway of empire, had become a river of shame. But from that shame would come transformation. Bazalgette's great sewer system, built in response to the crisis of 1858, would serve London for more than a century. The network of tunnels and pipes that carried waste away from the city would become a model for urban infrastructure around the world. The Great Stink lasted only a few months, but its effects were felt for generations. It forced London to confront the consequences of its own success, to acknowledge that growth without planning was not progress but catastrophe. The smell had been unbearable, but it had also been undeniable, a crisis that demanded action, not just discussion. As autumn arrived and the temperatures dropped, the Thames began to smell like a river again, rather than an open sewer. The crisis passed, but its lessons remained. London had learned that the infrastructure of civilization was not something that could be taken for granted, but something that required constant attention, constant investment, constant vigilance. The Great Stink of 1858 stands as a reminder that even the greatest cities are only as strong as their ability to manage the basic functions of human life. In the end, the smell that brought London to its knees also forced it to build the foundation for its future. Network of sewers that would make the city truly modern, truly livable, truly worthy of its place at the center of the world. Verse 4. The Dust Bowl Migration. Following the Okies west, our journey through humanity's encounters with an unforgiving environment brings us now to a different kind of exodus, not from cold or stench, but from dust and drought, from the failure of the very soil that had promised prosperity to become a desert of broken dreams. In April of 1935, a dust storm swept across the Great Plains with the fury of a living thing. From Texas to Nebraska, from Kansas to Colorado, the sky turned black with dirt, not the gentle darkness of storm clouds, but an angry, choking wall of earth torn from its moorings and flung skyward by winds that seemed to have no mercy. Ruby Henderson stood at the kitchen window of her farmhouse outside Boise City, Oklahoma, watching the storm approach. She had seen dust storms before. They had become as common as sunrise in recent years, but this one was different. It stretched from horizon to horizon, a mountain of earth moving across the prairie like the end of the world. She called to her husband, Floyd, who was trying to secure the barn door against the wind. "Floyd," she shouted over the howling air, "you better come see this." But Floyd was already running toward the house, his face covered with a bandana, his eyes wide with something that might have been fear or wonder or both. Behind him, the wall of dust rose higher than the grain elevator in town, higher than the church steeple, higher than anything they had ever seen. It was beautiful and terrible, like watching their own land rise up and march away. This was Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, the day that would become the symbolic climax of the Dust Bowl era. But for the Henderson family, like thousands of others across the Great Plains, it was just another day in a catastrophe that had been unfolding for years, a slow-motion disaster that had turned their world inside out. The dust, when it hit, was not like rain or snow, those familiar visitors from the sky. It was their own topsoil, their own future, blowing away. It seeped through every crack in the house, under doors, around windows, through the walls themselves. Ruby had learned to stuff wet rags in the cracks, to cover the food, to dampen cloth over her children's faces while they slept. But nothing could keep it out entirely. The Hendersons had been farming this land for 15 years, ever since Floyd's father had helped him buy the 160 acres with a loan from the bank in Boise City. They had planted wheat, golden waves of it that stretched to the horizon. The war in Europe had made wheat precious, and the rains had been good, and for a while, it seemed like the land would make them rich. But then the rains stopped. First for a season, then for a year, then for years. The wheat withered. The topsoil, no longer held by deep prairie grasses, began to lift with every wind. What had been farmland became desert, and what had been desert became a moonscape of drifting sand. The morning after Black Sunday, Ruby swept 6 inches of dust from her kitchen floor. She had done this nearly every day for 2 years, but it never got easier. The dust wasn't just dirt, it was her husband's hopes, her children's future, her own dreams of a home on the prairie, all of it ground fine and scattered to the wind. Floyd Henderson held out longer than most. He was a stubborn man, proud of his connection to the land, unwilling to admit that the prairie had defeated him. He tried everything, different seeds, different plowing techniques, prayers and curses, and desperate calculations of debt and hope. But by the summer of 1935, even he could see that the mathematics of farming had changed. The land that had once yielded 30 bushels of wheat per acre now yielded dust and disappointment. The decision to leave was not made in a single moment, but accumulated over months of failed crops and mounting debt. A bank had been patient, but patience has limits. The final notice came in August, typed on official letterhead that seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. Final notice of foreclosure. Floyd read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast every morning for 15 years. Ruby found him there an hour later, the letter still in his hands. She didn't need to read it to understand. She had been preparing for this moment, in small ways, for months, mending clothes more carefully, teaching the children to waste nothing, saying goodbye to the place in her heart before she had to say goodbye with her feet. "We'll go to California," Floyd said finally. "My brother Carl says there's work in the fields around Bakersfield. Says a man can make $2 a day picking fruit." $2 a day. It seemed like a fortune to people who had watched their wealth blow away with the topsoil. But the journey to California was long and expensive, and they had little money left after paying what they could to the bank. The Henderson family spent 2 weeks preparing for the journey. They sold what they could: the plow, the harness, the kitchen table that had been Ruby's grandmother's, and loaded the rest into their 1931 Chevrolet. The car was not in good condition, but it would have to serve as home, transportation, and storage for the next 1,000 miles. The children, Mary, age 12, and Tommy, age 8, helped pack their few remaining possessions. Mary carefully wrapped her mother's china in newspaper, though they all knew it would probably not survive the journey. Tommy wanted to bring his dog, Rex, but there was no room in the car and no money to feed an extra mouth. The decision to leave Rex with a neighbor was perhaps the hardest part of leaving for the boy, harder even than leaving the only home he had ever known. On September 15, 1935, the Henderson family joined the Great Migration West. They were part of a procession that stretched along Highway 66. Cars and trucks loaded with furniture and children, dreams deferred and hopes relocated. The newspapers called them Okies, though they came from all across the Dust Bowl states Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico. The term Okie was not meant kindly. It carried the weight of prejudice, the assumption that these migrants were somehow lesser, that their poverty was evidence of moral failing rather than environmental catastrophe. California newspapers warned of the Okie invasion, as if these families fleeing drought and foreclosure were somehow a threat to the Golden State. But the Hendersons, like most of the migrants, were not looking for charity or handouts. They were looking for work, for a chance to rebuild their lives, for soil that would grow crops and rain that would fall when it was supposed to. They were willing to work for it, to start over, to prove themselves worthy of a second chance. The journey west was an education in hardship. The Chevrolet broke down outside Amarillo, Texas, and Floyd had to spend precious dollars getting it repaired. They slept in the car most nights, pulled over at roadside rest stops, or in the fields beside the highway. Ruby had packed sandwiches, but they were gone by the third day, and after that the family lived on crackers and canned beans, supplemented by whatever fruit they could buy cheaply at roadside stands. The other migrants they met along the way shared information, which routes were best, which towns were friendly to travelers, where work might be found. There was a community of sorts among the displaced, a fellowship of people who understood what it meant to lose everything and start over. Outside Flagstaff, Arizona, they encountered a roadblock. Local authorities, overwhelmed by the flood of migrants, were turning away families who couldn't prove they had jobs waiting in California. Floyd had no such proof, only his brother's letter saying there might be work, but he had learned to talk his way through such obstacles. He spoke respectfully to the officer, explained about the farm, about the drought, about his willingness to work. Something in his manner, or perhaps simply the sight of his children sleeping in the back seat, convinced the officer to let them pass. California, when they finally reached it, was not the paradise they had imagined. The Central Valley was hot and dry, not so different from the plains they had left behind. The work, when they could find it, was backbreaking picking grapes and oranges, cotton and potatoes, following the harvest from farm to farm like migrant birds. The migrant camps were overcrowded and unsanitary. Families lived in tents or makeshift shelters, often without running water or proper sanitation. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Children went to school irregularly, if at all. The California schools were overwhelmed by the influx of migrant children, many of whom were behind in their studies, many of whom spoke with accents that marked them as outsiders. But the Henderson family, like most of the Dust Bowl migrants, was determined to make it work. Floyd found steady employment at a large farm outside Bakersfield, picking fruit in season and doing general labor in the off-season. Ruby took in washing and mending for other families. Mary and Tommy enrolled in the local school, where they faced the daily challenge of proving they belonged. The prejudice was real and persistent. Okie was a term that followed them everywhere, whispered in grocery stores, shouted from passing cars, written on signs that said, "No Okies need apply." The migrants were blamed for every social problem, every economic downturn, every strain on public resources. They were accused of being lazy, dirty, immoral, everything except what they actually were. Hard-working people displaced by circumstances beyond their control. Yet slowly, gradually, many of the migrants began to build new lives. They found work, saved money, moved out of the camps and into regular housing. Their children adapted to California schools and began to think of themselves as Californians. The trauma of the Dust Bowl became a family story, a part of their history, but not their entire identity. The Hendersons were among the successful ones. By 1940, Floyd had saved enough money to rent a small house in Bakersfield. Ruby had found work in a cannery, steady employment that provided income year-round. Mary had graduated from high school and was working as a secretary. Tommy had joined the high school football team and was talking about college. But they never forgot the dust, the failure of the rains, the morning when they loaded their lives into a Chevrolet and drove west toward an uncertain future. The experience had changed them, marked them, made them part of a generation that understood both the fragility of prosperity and the resilience of the human spirit. The Dust Bowl migration was one of the largest internal migrations in American history, but it was also one of the most successful. Most of the migrants eventually found work, established homes, raised families. They brought with them a work ethic forged in adversity, a determination strengthened by loss, a perspective broadened by displacement. The children of the Dust Bowl migrants would go on to build California's aerospace industry, to fight in World War II, to participate in the great economic expansion of the post-war era. They would become teachers and engineers, farmers and entrepreneurs, contributing to the growth and prosperity of their adopted state. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between success and security, they would remember the dust, the way it moved like a living thing across the prairie, the way it filled their lungs and clouded their vision, the way it carried away everything they had worked for and forced them to discover who they were when everything else was gone. The Great Migration West was not just a movement of people, but a transformation of identity, a journey that took families from the certainty of place to the possibility of reinvention. It was a reminder that home is not just where you come from, but where you choose to build your life, where you plant your hopes and tend your dreams, where you learn to call the dust of a new place your own. Conclusion. And so we come to the end of our journey through these moments when the earth itself seemed to turn against humanity, when the forces of climate and environment reminded our species of its place in the larger order of things. From the year without a summer to the end of the Norse in Greenland, from the great stink of London to the Dust Bowl migration, we have seen how humans respond when their world changes beyond recognition. We have witnessed the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, the way communities adapt and endure, the way hope persists even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. These stories, separated by centuries and continents, are united by a common thread, the recognition that we are not masters of our environment, but participants in it, subject to forces larger than ourselves, dependent on the delicate balance of systems we only partially understand. Yet what emerges from these tales is not despair, but a kind of quiet confidence in human resilience. In 1816, families loaded their wagons and headed west. In medieval Greenland, Norse farmers adapted their lives to an increasingly hostile climate. In Victorian London, engineers built sewers that would serve the city for generations. In the 1930s, migrants carried their hopes and skills across a continent, rebuilding their lives in new soil. The earth continues to change around us, as it always has, as it always will. But these stories remind us that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding ways to survive, and even thrive in conditions that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can take comfort in this long view of human endurance, in the knowledge that we are part of a species that has faced the end of summer, the failure of the rains, the rising of the waters, and found ways to carry on. The dust settles, the ice melts, the sun returns, and life, in all its stubborn persistence, continues. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow will bring its own challenges and its own possibilities, and that somewhere in the quiet spaces between sleeping and waking, the long story of human adaptation continues to unfold, one day, one family, one journey at a time.